So name of the reading is Analysis of Active Portfolio Management. So this reading we can roughly break down into three larger parts. The first part of reading could be thought of as performance attribution. So performance attribution would mean that you have a fund manager, he's been given a benchmark generated a return of 10%, your fund manager generated, let's say, 15%. So that means he's been able to generate that additional return of 5%, to which we are going to call as value added in this reading. So value added is 5%. We would want to analyze why do we have those 5% extra. Is it because he was very smart in picking up sectors, or was it because of the security selection? So when you're doing this is performance attribution. So we would be looking at some fancy formulas here, but after a couple of practice questions, you're going to be all right. Then we will jump on to the information ratio and all the stuff around this, but we would look at all the ex-ante measures. So ex-ante would be forward looking, trying to forecast how the fund manager is going to do. And in the third section, we would again be on information ratio and things around that, but then we would be on the ex post. Now the trick with this reading is that there are too many fancy formulas, and prima facie it would look too much. So I think every second paragraph in the curriculum throws a new formula, but roughly there are about 16 to 17 of those. Okay, and even though there are 16 or 17, about 8 or 9 of them are kind of repetitive. So there are the true formulas that we need to really remember are 7-8 of them, and our strategy would be that we will do one formula and immediately solve a couple of questions around it. So that way we'll get comfortable with the concept. So let's first spend some time and get through the performance attribution part. So imagine now we have a schedule like this. So what we have is WB, this is going to be weight in the benchmark, and then we have WP, weight in the portfolio, return on the benchmark and return on the portfolio. Let us say benchmark has three major sectors: pharmaceutical, banking and IT. The weights assigned in the benchmark are 30%, 30% and 40%. Your fund manager is more bullish on pharma, so he decided instead of investing 30%, we are going to invest 50%. But he feels that banking isn't going to be as great, so he decides to put in 40% here. He decides to put in 20% here, and then he decides to put in 30% in the IT. Return on the benchmark, so 15, 7, 5. Return on the portfolio, 25, 10 and 10%. Now we are going to do one comprehensive example, and in this example itself we are going to cover all aspects of performance attribution. Now I don't want you to write, just observe carefully. The first thing that we are going to do is we are going to figure out how much is the actual return that we've earned. Okay, so that is going to be return on the portfolio, and return on the portfolio is going to be a function of how much money we've put in the portfolio, the weight of different sectors, and how much returns have we earned on each of those sectors. Are we okay with this? So that's going to be 50% into 25% plus 20% into 10% plus 30% into 10%. This is your actual realized return, and that's going to be how much? 17.5. So this is your realized return of 17.5. Return on the benchmark. So return on the benchmark is going to be a function of these two variables. So we will say 30% into 15%, and then this 30% into 7%, and this 40% into 5%. So your return on the benchmark will be 8.6. Now you can clearly see, compared to the benchmark, our portfolio has given substantially higher returns. We call that number as value added. Okay, so we would call that number as value added, and we will simply calculate this as return on the portfolio minus return on the benchmark. So that's going to be 17.5 minus 8.6, that is 8.9%. And the first part is essentially about decomposition of that 8.9. Are we okay with this? So I'm going to wait for a couple of minutes. You can finish writing this. He asked whether value added is same as active return. Yes. But whether it is same as alpha? No. Okay, so this 8.9 could be separated into alpha and beta component if the beta of portfolio and the benchmark is different. But here in this reading, both curriculum and Schweizers, they have made the assumption that the beta component in both of them is same, and therefore you would call them as value added or alpha for this example. Okay, but they are different concepts. Guys, are we okay here? So now understand this. We have to break down this 8.9 into three parts. Now, the curriculum has both the formulas, breaking them down into two parts or breaking them down into three parts. I'm going to do the three-part formula because that's more intuitive and easier to apply on the exams. So some part of that 8.9 has come because of the asset allocation or sector allocation. So sector allocation is that we invested more into pharma but less into banking and IT. So maybe that sector allocation has contributed to additional return. Some part of that could be allocated to security selection. So security selection, if you'd observe, return on the benchmark was 15, but our portfolio for the same sector gave us 25. That means the securities that we picked up must have been better than what securities were there in the benchmark. And then there is one component which comes through the interaction of the first two variables. On the exam, you are going to, if they ask you specifically what is security selection and they do not talk about interaction, you're just going to add up the two numbers and you're going to say that interaction as well as security selection is the true security selection component. That's how the formulas is built in your syllabus. Are we okay with this? You'll understand that. So don't worry about what interaction means. Just let's do it step by step. So now next 10 minutes are extremely important. Once you get hold of what's happening here, you would not be required to remember the formula, but just focus on what we're doing. So I'm going to plot everything else again one more time. I'm going to plot return on benchmark. So before I do that, now what we are trying to do is we are trying to find out how much of that return has come through sector allocation. So I'm going to replot that table in the similar fashions. So weight on the benchmark 30, 30, 40. Weight of the portfolio 50, 20 and 30. Return on the benchmark 15, 7 and 5. 15, 7 and 5. This was pharma, banking and IT. Pharma, banking and IT. But I am not going to plot return on the portfolio here because right now we want to keep the asset selection, the security selection constant, or we want to remove the impact of security selection. We just have to discuss about or figure out the sector allocation impact. So we do not allow that fund manager to select the security. Okay, we just allow him to change the weights. So you just plot this data and you again do the same calculation. Which two calculation? You calculate return on the benchmark. Now return on the benchmark here and here, they are not going to be different, isn't it? Because at the end of the day you are going to use the same data. So your return on benchmark 30 into 15, 30 into 7, 40 into 5. Guys, are we okay here? So that number will come out to be 8.6%. And this time I will calculate return on the portfolio for sector allocation strategy. Return on the portfolio for sector allocation. So return on the portfolio would be calculated as weight on the portfolio but return on the benchmark. So assumption is, if the fund manager was not allowed for security selection, if he was allowed only for sector allocation, then the return on his securities would have been same but the weights would have been different, correct? So we are kind of isolating the effect of that sector allocation. Should I repeat this again? So that 8.9, which is your active return, is coming from three sources. One, you were very smart in allocation of money to different sectors. Second, you were very smart in security selection. And third is some sort of a mathematical plug. Okay. Now we want to find out how much of that is coming because of sector allocation. So we make an assumption. Assumption is, let us not allow the portfolio manager to select the securities. So let's force him to select those securities which were there in the benchmark. So return on the benchmark and portfolios are same, guys. And therefore we don't write that column at all. We just write this. And now we do a weighted average, which would be like this. 50% into 15, 20% into 7, and 30% into 5. How much is that? 10.4440. And therefore the returns that could be allocated to returns due to sector allocation, those would be 10.4 minus 8.6, which is 1.8 positive. So this is your first component. Are we okay with this? So on the exam, if you've been asked to calculate how much of returns we've earned due to sector allocation, so what you do is you just assume that manager was not allowed for security selection. And if manager was not allowed for security selection, then return on the benchmark and return on the portfolios are same. So you just calculate the return on the benchmark, you calculate return on the portfolio, assuming that he earns these numbers 15, 7 and 5, take the difference, that's your answer. As simple as that. Are we okay with this? Now the same logic for security selection. And you would see how easy it becomes if you think like this. So again, now what we are going to assume is, we are going to assume that manager is not allowed for sector rotation. We have not allowed him to use sector allocation strategy. We've just allowed him to use security selection strategy. So what do? We will say weight in the benchmark. So that's 30, 30, 40. 30, 30, 40. This was pharma, banking and IT. Now, should I write weight in the portfolio? No, because we are not going to allow him to do that. Because weight in the portfolio would mean that he's either having an active positive weight or a negative weight. So we don't allow him to do that. Return on the benchmark, 15, 7 and 5. 15, 7 and 5. Return on the portfolio, 25, 10, 10. 25, 10 and 10. Again, exactly the same logic. Return on the benchmark, that's not going to change. That's going to be 8.6%. Return on the portfolio for a security selection component. So we assume if it was a scenario where the manager was not allowed for sector allocation, he was only allowed to pick up the security, then how much he would have earned? Then he would have earned following returns. His weights are same as the benchmark, 30% into 25%, 30% into 10%. I'm using the actual returns here. 40% into the 10%, how much would that be? 14.5. Okay. And then those returns which could be attributed due to security selection. Returns that could be attributed to security selection. So those returns are going to be 14.5 minus 8.6, that is 5.9990. So 5.90. Now the last component. Last component is interaction. Now for interaction, you would have to make use of all the data. So pharma, banking and IT, pharma, banking and IT. So first we have weight on the benchmark, 30, 30, 40. Weight in the portfolio, 50, 20, 30. 50, 20, 30. Immediately I'm going to calculate something called as a active weight. So it was a conscious decision of the manager to put in 20% more in the pharma, to put in 10% less in the banking and 10% lesser in IT. In the same fashion, written on the benchmark, 15.75, and written on the portfolio, 25, 10, 10, 25, 10, 10, and immediately I'm going to calculate the active return on each of the sector. So here we've done 10% better, 3% better and 5% better. And your interaction component is essentially a weighted average of these numbers. So 20% into 10% minus 10% into 3% and minus 10% into 5%. How much? 5.2? 1.2. So interaction component is 1.2. Now if you're keen on knowing what is the interpretation, are you done writing? If you're keen on knowing what is the interpretation, you decided that you wanted to put in 20% more in pharma because you thought that in the benchmark pharma will be better than others, and you were right about that. So that went into sector allocation component. But your portfolio did 10% better than what the benchmark did. So you got benefit of that 2 extra percent because of the interaction component. You decided to put in minus 10% because you thought that banking compared to other space in the sector is going to underperform. You were again right about that. But your portfolio did 3% better there. So you kind of lost out that benefit of 3% into minus 10. Again minus 10, you lost out benefit of that 5. Which means that you're losing out or earning some extra part here depending on what weights you've decided to keep. So that is the interaction component. Are we okay with this? Now we go back and fill in the blanks and check if it's totaling up. So sector allocation was 1.8. So I'm going to write that here. Security selection was 5.9. And interaction component was positive 1.2. Please add up the three numbers. So take a total of these three components, 1.8 plus 5.9 plus 1.2. Is it matching up with 8.9? Yes. Now on the exam, if they ask you how much of return have you earned because of the security selection component, your answer is going to be 5.9 plus 1.2. And on the exam, if you've been asked how much have you earned because of sector allocation, your answer is going to be 1.8. So the smartest way to handle this, if you know 8.9, just calculate 1.8. And the difference between these two is going to be because of security selection. Yes, Roman, you had some question? Yeah, any questions here? So again, the thought process, there is a different formula in the curriculum. I've used a formula which is typically used in the level 3 syllabus. That's a more advanced formula compared to what we have in the curriculum. And I think this formula makes more sense because it allows you to build an easier thought process. Thought process is that if you want to find out how much returns have you earned because of the sector allocation, then you simply do not allow the manager to perform security selection and then calculate the returns, take the difference. How much we've earned because of security selection, you do not allow him sector allocation, then calculate the returns. And interaction is the two deltas. Multiply them, you get the interaction value. Will you be able to handle this? So give it a shot. Let's do an example. Let us say we have let's say we have just two sectors here. Weight in the benchmark is 40 and 60, and weight in the portfolio is 70 and 30. Return on the benchmark is 5 and 12. Return on the portfolio 25 and 35. Okay, we intentionally constructed it this way because prima facie what it appears is that the manager seems to have messed up with sector allocation. Why did he mess up with sector allocation? Because he invested a lot of amount in a sector where benchmark returns are very less, and he invested lesser amount in benchmark returns were higher, but he seems to have done really good in security selection. So based on this we get to know the skill of the manager. Are you following this? So calculate active return and break it down into three parts. The first thing that we do is we do return on benchmark. So that's going to be 40% into 5, 2. So that's 9.2. Then return on the portfolio, 25 into 70, 14 and 3.5, 17.5. How much? 28. So that's 28%, which is calculated as the weighted average. Then we calculate the active return, and your active return is 28 minus 9.2, that is 18.8%. And now this 18.8 we are going to break down into three parts. 18.8 we are going to break down into three parts. So sector allocation, security selection, and the interaction component. So for sector allocation, we assume that we are not going to allow the fund manager to select the securities. So we just take this weight, these returns, this weight and these returns. So we already have return on benchmark, that's 9.2. And return on the portfolio, assuming security selection wasn't allowed, so that would be 70% into 5, that's 3.5, plus 30% into 12, that's 3.6, so total 7.1. So 7.1 minus 9.2, 7.1 minus 9.2, we are looking at minus 2.1. So as far as sector allocation is concerned, we can clearly see that it has gone wrong. How many of you got this right? Okay. Then security selection. So here we assume that fund manager is allowed to select the securities, but he is not allowed to change the weights, just one at a time. So return on benchmark same, return on the portfolio now will become 25 into 40%, that's 10, 35 into 60%, that's going to be 21. So your returns here are 31 minus on the benchmark 9.2, so 21.8 is because of the security selection. And the interaction component, so in interaction we take active weights, that's 30% and minus 30%, and we take active returns, so that's 20% and that's 23 percentage, so that's going to be 6 and that's going to be 6.9, please cross check, and therefore this is going to be minus 0.9, and the three numbers should add up to 18.8 percentage. Are we okay with this?